Hello and welcome to Radical with me, Amol Rajan. On the show this week, what we try and do is basically answer a very simple question, which is if Nigel Farage becomes Prime Minister as the leader of reform, what would he actually do with power? What are his politics? What's his plan for government? Well, our guest this week is someone who has a deep and growing influence on the right of British politics and a deep understanding of the right of American politics. Dr. James Orr is a Cambridge philosopher and theologian who is friends with J.D. Vance, the American Vice President, Peter Thiel, the very influential tech billionaire and investor over in America. And over here, he's just set up a think tank called the Centre for a Better Britain. It is sat right next to Reform HQ, and it is basically trying to come up with a plan for government under reform. And if you want to understand where British politics is going, particularly the right of British politics, let me humbly suggest that Dr. James Orr is someone whose ideas, whose thinking, whose worldview you need to encounter and listen to. Right, shall we talk about the future of the universe? James, it's so nice. Dr. Orr, I should call you so. Dr. Orr, as you drink a bit of water out of a mug with my face on. How are you?
Very well indeed. It's good to be with you.
It's wonderful to see you. I feel somewhat immersed in your world and thought, and we've met a couple of times and we've spoken in the past, and I feel like your influence has grown even more. And I don't know if that's because of the conversations that we've had, but your influence and the sense that what you're thinking about and trying to do is timely and topical has certainly grown. Should we begin? We're going to go back and talk a bit about how your life and thought evolved, but should we begin with what's your sense of how much trouble the Conservatives in this country are in?
On the 1st of May of this year, we had the local election results, one of the worst electoral drubbings.
Lost over 670 seats.
The Tories have had in living memory. And I was addressing a wonderful group of Tories. It was my first and probably my last Tory Association speech. And they were just, they were.
Where was it?
This was in deep England, in Suffolk. And I'm not going to I won't name the place, but they were wonderful people and fascinating questions. And I wasn't sure on the drive over what I was going to say. And, what does one say at a Tory Association? I've never been to a Tory Association meeting. But I found myself sort of riffing on this idea that where the Tories are now is where the Liberal Party was in 1923. And I could imagine, the Liberal Party in 1923 saying to itself, looking at Ramsay MacDonald, thinking,
the rise of Labour. Yeah.
Who does this guy think he is? He thinks he can be Prime Minister. This working class movement, these trade unions, they think they can run the country. They're going to put a coal miner into the Home Office. Who's going to be in their cabinet? And yet, that's exactly what happened. They would have been saying to themselves, don't they know who we are? We're the Liberal Party. We're the party of Palmerston and of Gladstone and Asquith and Lloyd George and Burke himself. They think they can just unseat us. And yet that's exactly what happened. And their demise was slow and painful, and to some extent they're still around in the Lib Dem party. But I think that's where the Tories are now. It's not 1997 with William Hague. It's not 2001 with Duncan Smith. It's not Michael Howard. It's not just they've taken a bit of a blow and they'll come back in the next electoral cycle or two. I think there is really an existential threat for them on the right, because for the first time in the history of British politics, we have an increasingly credible right-wing party that is, as it were, introducing certainly a lot of energy on the right. We'll have to, 4 years is a long time, and it may be that an election is called sooner than that. But I think what we're seeing is very difficult for people who are historically minded, like the two of us are, to just contemplate the thought that, maybe it's over. And just as it would have been very difficult for, eggheads in the early 1920s to contemplate the thought, maybe the Liberal Party just doesn't have a right to exist forever.
So Ramsay MacDonald and that early Labour Party were really the parliamentary representation of the trade unions. In other words, they had an existing infrastructure which they could use to eventually put, for instance, Clement Attlee into a wartime coalition, and then 10 Downing Street. Does reform have... this country could hardly be more different. The technology these days is very, very different. The circumstances are different, and so on and so forth. Does reform have, in your understanding, the beginnings of that infrastructure? And is part of what you're trying to do with your think tank, the Centre for a Better Britain, create the intellectual space where that infrastructure can flourish over the next few years?
Well, you're right to point that out, that, that first quite sort of fragile McDonnell minority government was sort of riding the wave of a trade union movement that was well underway at the turn of the century, 20, 25 years before that. But I think, and then you can look at Reform and say, well, look, this party's only been around 5 minutes. In a way, that's true. But in a sense, it's also not.
UKIP and the Brexit Party.
There's this sort of that kind of, national preference, focus on Britain, independence, pride, qualified pride in our history and heritage, and the idea that we should be putting ourselves before we should be putting the citizens of other countries. That kind of movement has been there, and Nigel Farage has done more to catalyse that than anybody else. This is why he's one of the most consequential politicians of modern times. So now, how, in terms of the actual sort of practicalities of the infrastructure, getting government ready, or getting general election ready over the next 2, 3, 4 years, I mean, that's an enormous logistical challenge. It's an enormous funding and financial challenge. It's an enormous policy challenge too. And my sense is that they can do it. And I went with actually one of a great editor of National Review, John O'Sullivan, a former advisor to Lady Thatcher. We had lunch in Cambridge, and I drove him to Suffolk again, and we went to the country's first conservative bookshop, Old Speak Books. Quick shout out to Joe. But anyway, John gave a fantastic little speech, and then I said a few words. And then John said, and John is a old school Tory, and said, so I know we've not been doing too well recently, but how many in this room are going to vote for the Tories? Just give us another chance. And there must have been about 40 people in the room, and there was an awkward silence, and you could see, probably more out of politeness than anything else, one man in the corner tentatively put his hand, half a hand up. And then I said, and who here will be voting for Reform? Everyone's hand went up, everyone in the room. It was the first time I'd seen up close, felt the fury against the two-party duopoly, the sense of it's time to just break the glass. This is in an emergency, and maybe Nigel Farage isn't the right person to do it, but he's going to be better than anyone else.
What can and should Kemi Badenoch, who I interviewed last week, what can or should she do?
It's very difficult to know what she can do. I mean, I understand entirely the position that she's taking of, namely, taking time over getting the policy right.
Rebuilding the party.
But my worry is that politics is just moving too fast. I went to a Reform press conference on crime. So, we're in deep summer, and Nigel had just he's setting up a 6-week campaign on lawless Britain. This is what I'm going to do. We're going to build Nightingale prisons, and we're going to have 3 strikes and you're in prison for life, and so on and so forth. And I thought to myself, they are, is it the sort of carefully curated, beautifully worked out policy that we might be seeing in 2, 3 years' time from Kemi's team? And it's a very, very good team.
It's positioning, though, isn't it? It's about saying, you care about crime, we're the party to fix it.
There we go. And we're doing it now. We care about it now. And it's an emergency, and this is what we're going to do, and this is why you should start thinking about us. And I think, the kind of agnosticism the kind of agnostically ideological atmosphere within the current Conservative Party is partly one of convenience. That it is a party now that is, I think, dominated by the Tory left. It's not just a question of can we get somebody better than Kemi Badenoch in from the point of view of the British right. The question is, well, can anyone save that party?
Is there a danger that the splitting of the right costs the right in electoral terms pretty soon? Because the fact is, the Conservatives have 120 MPs. They're getting a lot of money. Kemi Badenoch was saying to me last week that she's got the fundraising's going really well. And the fact is, there is if you're people who, for instance, advocate leaving the ECHR, it's just a bit weird to pretend that you belong to 2 different parties. I mean, the fact is, Nigel Farage's worldview and Robert Jenrick's are very, very similar. So wouldn't it make sense for them to come together in some form?
Yeah, it does. I mean, it's a big debate at the moment. The city people debate this the whole time in the markets. Is volatility a sign of vitality or is it a sign of risk? The Bitcoin bros will always say it's the volatility of Bitcoin that shows is a sign of vitality. Things that are not volatile are dead, are inert. And I think that's true of the British right. I think the volatility you're seeing at the moment is a sign of vitality. I think the intellectual energy, the policy energy, the philosophical energy is on the right now. How that then maps out electorally, just in terms of, the ballot box, is going to be very, very interesting. I mean, look, what was the poll from like a week or two ago? I think it was Reformers on 31%, governments on 23%, Tories are on 17%. And the question is, and look, and the trends are, trend lines are, but we're looking at Reform upper 20s, Labour kind of bottom half of the 20s, and Tories seem to be plateauing in the sort of
teens.
In the teens. So the question then is something dramatic going to change between now and August 2029, the latest point that Keir Starmer can call the next election? Now, you might say, Reform is one packet of Benson and Hedges away from completely dissolving, and it's too dependent upon. It's just the Nigel Farage show.
So what you're alluding to there is that Nigel Farage, who's had a good time in his earthly sojourn, he's smokes a lot of fags, and who knows if that's going to mean that
he's cut down a lot.
He's cut down a lot, and he's been through a lot on the health front.
Yeah.
People know he's had testicular cancer, he survived plane crashes, and so on and so forth. But if he has a health scare, could Reform be exposed as really a cult of Nigel?
Yeah, and actually, I think if you look at some kind of granular polling that's been done in the last 2 or 3 months, actually, interestingly, the Reform vote is pretty stable, absent Farage. That anecdote I shared the other day, just a few minutes ago about, in the bookshop, after they all put their hands up, I was greeted with a barrage of questions about why Nigel had gone so soft. Why he was tacking to the centre, etc.
They believe in the Reform worldview as much as,
so
or
these
even
were
more
people
than
who were going to vote Reform no matter what, but and in fact might have been more comfortable seeing a more radical figure than Nigel heading up the party. So I don't think it's as straightforward as that. I think it might be. You might have said that UKIP in 2015 was the Nigel Farage show, but that is not the case with Reform, as it gradually sort of populates its sort of leadership with some very interesting figures. And I think, so the question is something dramatic going to change between now and 2029? Are we going to discover that Keir Starmer is secretly an incredible prime minister and an amazingly sort of adept political manoeuvrer? Maybe, but I think probably the jury isn't out on that question anymore. Is Kemi, with the sort of big political commissions that she's going to be unveiling in 2 years' time, is that going to, as it were, convince the nations to the point that she doubles her poll lead?
Or is Nigel Farage going to fall out with someone as he has with Rupert Lowe and Ben Habib?
Well, he's falling out with these people on the inside, and everybody was saying at the time, everyone in SW1, everybody on right-wing Twitter was saying Reform is over. And remember, this was the beginning of March, right?
Was that when he fell out with Rupert Lowe?
It falls out with Rupert. I think around 8th of March is when it really starts. First week of March, and it really is just blowing up all over the place. And everyone's saying Reform is toast, Nigel is toast. We're going to set up this movement. We're going to set up that movement. And then on the 1st of May, Reform gets one of the most extraordinary electoral victories in the locals that we've ever seen a third party get. I mean, it was astonishing, those numbers, particularly given that it was up against the most successful election-winning machine in political history. So, I think it's easy to sort of, look at all of those, the feuding and the sort of the minutiae of kind of interpersonal sort of dynamics and politics in SW1, and then just sort of assume that the broader electorate has not got better things to be doing with its time and is just following all the twists and turns. And I just don't think that's the case. So what's so interesting about the fallout within Reform and the sort of the kind of chaos that you always get with any disruptive startup is how little impact it seems to have had on its electoral base.
You mentioned a moment ago the intellectual energy and the policy energy that you want to bring to these debates. What are you trying to do with the Centre for a Better Britain?
I think the politics of national preference is going to be the organising horizon of the Centre for Better Britain. And I think we are the first think tank, certainly since 2016, to have sort of been set up with that as kind of very self-consciously as the kind of organising matrix and prism of everything we do. Policy Exchange is an outstanding think tank, Centre for Policy Studies, IEA, Taxpayers Alliance, as you say. All of these do very, very good things, run fantastic projects. But none of them have got this sort of post-Brexit, pro-nation, pro-sovereignty, pro-Britain sort of impulse and sort of and framework. So that's going to be the kind of that's going to be the sort of the animating ideal for everything that we do. And I think the think tanks are very unusual things in Britain. In many ways they're sort of departure lounges, for politicians to be, MPs to be, very different from what you have in America. In America, you'll have somewhere like the Heritage or the Brookings Institute, which are enormous motherships. I mean, Kevin Roberts has built up the Heritage to the point where I think it's getting about $100 million a year in income. And what it can do is it can set up a Project 2025. It can come up with an enormous policy shop window. It can also then help staff an entire administration with hundreds and hundreds of bright young things who pass through. There's nothing like that in Britain. Is
that what you'd like to do? I mean, would you like to build the CBB? We'll get to why it was nearly called Resolute 1850, which is a very interesting story, a bit of history there as well. But would you like to build the CBB to become, as it were, a British Heritage Foundation and the sort of the preeminent, well-funded, but the preeminent think tank for the reform bit of the right in British politics?
I think one of the challenges that there is in SW1 in the kind of policy-making space is that the Tories have been around forever. And the mutual suspicion is between the Tories and the Reform Party is real, unsurprising. And Reform is still quite low status, It's only mavericks like, me and a Tim Montgomery who might come out and say, well, actually, maybe we should, give these guys a chance. There's still that sense of we're going to kind of hold our nose a bit around these guys, and I think that's a shame, because I think certainly it's a disaster if the polls continue to be what they are and Reform ends up governing the country. We should all want them to succeed, and that means making sure that they've got policy behind them that is properly costed, properly worked out, coordinated across a sort of a broad platform.
And it's interesting because you do podcasts and you do interviews, and we've had these conversations, and you're a public intellectual, a public academic. And I think one of the things that's valuable about the fact that you come out and speak is that you're prepared to answer difficult questions. And one of the things I know you'll be mindful of, is that some of the funding around the think tanks over the last 15 years or so has been the subject of tremendous speculation and conspiracy theories, actually, in the UK. And in America, there is huge concern that because of the organisation of super PACs and so on, you basically get dark money or shady money infiltrating politics. Now, actually, one of the things that I found quite interesting is that in what's been written so far about the CBB, there's quite a lot of information about people who are funding it. So a guy called Jonathan Brown, who used to be Chief Operating Officer at Reform, David Lilly, a metals trader who donated more than $250,000 to Reform, and Mark Thompson, an investor with interests in metals and fossil fuels. Certainly not Mark Thompson, the former Director General of the BBC. But is that something that you're prepared to say you'll continue to commit to, being transparent about where the money's coming from? Because frankly, you don't need to be secretive about people who want to, as you put it, create a new right.
Yeah, I mean, there's a tendency on the left, sometimes on the right, to engage in what I call the ad pecuniam fallacy. And this is the fallacy that, if somebody somewhere has paid you to do something, therefore you are immediately compromised just for that reason.
Not immediately, but it's useful to know, isn't it?
But it is useful to know, and I think we've been as transparent as we can. As far as I know, I don't think we have had any other donors other than those guys. And I think David and Mark, what attracted me to, one of the things that attracted me to the centre was David and Mark's support for it. In fact, David was a person, they're not just funders, they're also on the board, so they take an active role in overseeing the direction of the centre.
I don't know who are they.
They are, well, they're friends of Nigel from the late 80s, early 90s, and I think they want Nigel to succeed, and it's really it's partly friendship, but it's also commitment to the cause of reform. They've always been fellow travellers with him. And I think, if you're somebody like Nigel Farage, it has been, you contra mundum for 25, 30 years. You're probably the most demonized politician in Britain and has been for many, many years. And for somebody like that, and I think the same dynamic with Trump too, loyalty is going to matter a lot more to you than it will to most, even more to you than most politicians, just because, you've been through it at a time when very few people were loyal to you, very few people were willing to come alongside you. And I think probably Nigel, I don't want to, put words into his mouth, but I think Nigel probably feels that somebody like David and Mark, they've went boozing with him when they were doing in the commodities business in the late 80s, early 90s, and these are people he can trust.
So there's a sort of ambition for that think tank in terms of growing, and it's interesting you say that you'll continue to be transparent about who's putting the money behind you, though people giving money to think tanks is not intrinsically.
Yeah, I can't speak. Maybe that other things. We're not a charity. I think we're under any disclosure obligations, and that's not for any kind of nefarious reasons. It's just it's a better structure for what we want to do. But yes, I think. One advantage we have is we've got proximity to reform.
You're in the same building, aren't you?
And we're in the same building. We're in Millbank Tower. And I think one of the things I've noticed with other think tanks is not so. But I've never seen in 10 years or so of being involved in politics, I've never seen corruption. I've never seen a sort of donor coming in and trying to force a policy on a party just through cash, as it were. If anything, think tank, as I was saying earlier, think tanks in SW1, they barely keep the lights on. They really, really struggle to, I don't know what Policy Exchange's income is, probably maybe 1 million, maybe 2 million. It's tiny numbers relative to America. But one of the problems is that can have distortive effects on policy making. So you might have somebody who's got a real bee in his bonnet about climate change or net zero, and then it's like, right, here's the money, and just make sure that you're focusing on that. And I think the problem is there that you get a sort of disproportionate emphases on different policy areas. The challenge for reform is and indeed for any party that wants to be government ready, is can you actually come up with a plan that covers all the policy areas? Can you write your first King's Speech? What is the first budget going to look like?
Exactly.
And that means
that's a huge task.
It's an enormous task. And if a donor comes in with particular pet projects, that is something that part of my job is to say, no, we don't want your money, we don't want your influence, because what we're doing is something that has not really ever been tried before.
But also, can you come up with a plan that really withstands scrutiny? So, when I've spoken to Richard Tice, for instance, on the Today programme, a lot of other people you might call on the right of politics, people like Dominic Lawson, who writes a brilliant column in the Sunday Times, have been brutal about some of Reform's economic policies. And, actually, you're not here to answer for Reform, you can answer for the CBP. But there's a lot of people who say that what Reform have suggested so far in the economic sphere just doesn't add up. They make promises that are very hard to reconcile with reality, or they say, we're going to spend all this money, we're also going to cut your taxes, and we will continue to give them that scrutiny. But if your plan is to essentially come up with, as you say, the first King's Speech, a programme for government, and it's going to be driven by this idea of a politics of national preference, how are you going about that sort of task? Is it sort of, we saw a bit on crime recently with that press conference that Nigel Farage gave. Is it like you're going to sort of choose particular areas, the environment, taxation, welfare, pensions, criminal justice? How's that going to look? What's that going to look like over the next 4 years as Reform try, with your help, to come up with an actual costed programme for government?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think, when you are a startup party, you've got, you make it very tempting to make policy on the hoof, and you have to respond to, sort of existing existential concerns, and you need to remind the people and the electorate that you're still around and that you're thinking hard. And, it's very, very difficult when you're just focusing on, you're doing one press conference on one policy area, whether it's crime or environment, whatever it might be, not to think in the round and not to work out how this is going to be costed both within the policy area and across the board. And so I think, our challenge is going to be, Reform would have to run a Department of State. Every single Department of State is going to have
They have to run the Ministry of Agriculture and work out tapered tax relief for farmers.
Absolutely right. And so, now within that, there's still going to be some preferential ranking about what the country, where are the crisis points that the country is facing, where are the really sort of difficult policy areas that have to be addressed. Crime is certainly one, as Nigel was pushing very well yesterday morning at this press conference. Net zero is another, or rather, I think more this idea of energy sovereignty, this idea that, it is totally normal and certainly what a politics of national preference should want to seek for a country to be secure in its own, in the enabling conditions of any kind of economic flourishing, namely energy independence and energy sovereignty, energy security. And so, that's going to be a very important issue. I think to some extent, all the DEI stuff and the kind of worries about woke, and the kind of all those kind of cultural war issues.
DEI, for those who aren't immersed in this world, DEI is diversity, equity, and inclusion.
That's right, and it's kind of done as a sort of an acronym that's a sort of stand-in for the kind of the cultural wars of the last few years. My sense is there's been a bit of a vibe shift there. That feels a little bit 2024, a little bit 2023. I would be surprised if we're worrying that much about woke in 2029. But yes, I think the key thing will be the economics. I mean, and this is one thing that Alex Burkhardt, who's heading up Kemi Badenoch's policy work, really, I think, understands that getting the economy right and getting the economics right for every single policy area is going to be vital. And so in some ways, it's the first budget that's going to be more important than the first King's Speech.
So if the coalition government is broadly leftish on social and cultural issues and right on economic issues, and if reform is somehow the opposite, sort of more certainly right on social and cultural issues and becoming more leftish on economic issues, what does a new right, a radical right, a MAGA reformish right think is the route to kind of economic growth, if not pursuing the deregulation and low tax environment that in the 1980s, when Nigel Farage was a young Thatcherite metals trader? What does that economic leftish route to growth look like?
And this is a big question that's being asked a lot about reform. Are you kind of new right?
Singapore on Thames,
or is it a kind of Thatcher tribute act? And I think the answers you seem to be getting are: look, we're still big believers that big state, aggressive intervention, heavily regulated markets is not a good thing. It's not going to be conducive to economic flourishing. And I don't think that's going to change very much. Now, whether or not, and so where is growth, where is productivity going to come from? In 2029, it's going to be very, very hard to get growth day one. It will always take a year, 2 years, 3 years, and means doing some very unpopular things in order to achieve it. And, it is one of the great challenges of democracy. You've got a massive majority in favor of cutting taxes, massive majority in favor of increased public spending, and reform has not got a magic wand. And it's going to have to really kind of get the electorate used to, I think, from day one, the difficult decisions, that phrase beloved of all politicians, in a way that I think was probably not what Keir Starmer did. I mean, he did not use his honeymoon very well last year. He could have come in and straight away and said, look, we're going to have these welfare cuts and we've got to get them done right now. And he would have got away with it. I think he would have won that. And all the other sort of decisions that he could have taken that left till October to that disastrous first budget and is now trying to eke out, and he's just being defeated. Even though he's got one of the biggest majorities in living memory, he's been defeated on these flagship policy issues. And so I think it's going to be, there's going to have to be a sort of an honesty with the electorate in the run-up to 2029, and then that first year, those first 100 days, really, as we saw Trump 2.0 do, it's just everything was very, very well planned out, and it was a very, very, they knew that a lot was not going to be popular, some of it was going to be very popular, but it was efficient, it was done very fast, and I think certainly in Trump's case, it's beginning to bear fruit.
Nigel Farage, if he's going to be taken seriously as a future Prime Minister, which you're saying he already is going to have to say, we're going to have to do some really difficult things, is going to have to say what Kemi Badenoch says all the time, which is that there are no solutions, only trade-offs. There's no evidence yet, is there, that Nigel Farage is prepared to be really honest with people? And of course, he can answer these questions for himself, and I look forward to asking him these questions. But there's no evidence yet that he's been prepared to say those really unpopular things, which are true, which is the cost of being in government rather than being a campaigner. Formidable campaigner, he's run big campaigns, but if you're going to run things, you've got to say to people things they don't like.
That's true, but I think, there's the old line of, campaigning in poetry and governing in prose, which seems to be a sort of politician's shorthand for saying we can lie to you on the campaign trail and do something completely different when we're in power. And to some extent, this is it's a problem that every politician faces. A politician as canny as Nigel Farage is not going to be intervening, I think, on the triple lock.
4 years from an election.
4 years from a general election, that would be electoral suicide, and it would take a lot of pitch rolling to start to approach that question. I actually don't know what his views are on the triple lock, and actually, some of his instincts are surprisingly welfareist. If you think of the two child benefit cap debate. And so, I just don't know. He is going to have to be honest. He's going to have to lay out a program that is going to say, look, there's some nasty medicine that the country's going to have to take on day one, and I'm going to be open about that, and my party's going to back me. I think, one difference with, what is a reform parliamentary party in the 300s going to look like, if there's going to be such a thing, almost just inconceivable to think of it, but what would it look like? Will it look like the Parliamentary Labour Party in terms of the kind of all the caucuses and all the kind of ancient rivalries and ideological differences?
People's Front versus Judea versus
right.
People's
And
Front.
my sense is, the Tories have kind of got that too, but my sense is actually one of the advantages of having a completely fresh new parliamentary party is that the leadership will have a great deal more power than a Keir Starmer has, even with a majority of 160, and that Kemi Badenoch has over a party of 123. So I think actually, in the early, there'll be a sort of honeymoon period, I think, of a kind of a year, over 2 years, and those first 100 days are going to be absolutely vital to force the nasty cough medicine down the country's throat.
What you're trying to do in the world, the sort of, as it were, the sort of the set of social and moral and political questions that you're trying to answer, and the sort of, if you like, the problem to which James Orr's thought and work is an attempted solution. What are you trying to do?
I fell in love with philosophy when I was a city lawyer and just couldn't get enough of it, and decided to just walk away, head up to Cambridge, our alma mater, and just study and read books that nobody ever written in order to write books that nobody would ever read. And
The life of an academic.
The life of an academic.
Well, I'm married to one, but she won't forgive me for raising her name in that context.
It was a retreat into the ivory tower, a very conscious one. It was a kind of retirement. And I didn't for a moment think that my thought or my work would turn towards the public square very much at all. I mean, academics are always talking about impact and how we can, change the discourse and so on. And some of them actually are very good at it. But for the most part,
they're having war about footnotes, and they're going completely mad and neurotic and driving each other crazy.
Exactly. It's foot and note disease, they like to call it. And but
I never heard that. I like that.
But basically, most of us want to have a quiet, retiring life. And actually, I was always a big believer in that, writing the books that nobody would ever really hear about. Those are the books that would really change the discipline. And you'd have these eccentrics knocking around these senior common rooms who would write nothing for 10 years, and somebody would prod them, and then they would produce a book that was just completely transformative. And I suppose that's roughly the idea I had in mind. And then I guess, I want to say around about 2012, 2013, we witnessed from America, really this was an American export, the first rumblings of what you might call the cultural revolution breaking across the campuses of Britain, but particularly the elite campuses, particularly the Russell Group universities. And I found myself, I like to put on events, I like to put on debates, I like to invite a wide range of speakers to introduce students to. And the sort of first wave of cancellations, 2013, 2014, that I was in Oxford at the time when it really started, and I think I remember helping put a debate on about abortion in late 2014. I think we had Brendan O'Neill doing the pro-choice side, and we had Tim Stanley doing the pro-life side, and the college simply shut it down in response to a radical feminist group that simply didn't want this debate to happen. It's the sort of the pressure of groupthink. And I've said this before, that, the problem with groupthink is that wrong-think becomes evil-think. Where you've got a relatively balanced split on a neuralgic issue, 70-30, 80-20, then that is conducive to an intellectually flourishing ecosystem. But where you've got a position, like whether it's on climate, whether it's on Brexit, whether it's on empire, where the reality is you've got, well, maybe it's 80-20, but 15% of the 20 are not going to say anything. There you've got the conditions for a kind of sort of intellectual sort of mechanisms of ostracism. And that's what Nigel went through. I've gone through it a little bit to some extent, and that's what you've seen all across the West. I think the British universities have responded better on the whole. I think the British government, one of the very few things that one can, I think, congratulate the last government on, is pushing this piece of legislation through, the Freedom of Speech Higher Education Act, which has, I think, is going to have some mitigating effects on that problem. So that is what, as it were, radicalised me. That's what made me a suitable guest for the Radical podcast.
And that was a sort of cultural moment. But then there was also a political moment. In 2016, we had Brexit and the election of Donald Trump. At what point did those two phenomena and the fact that you were spending more time in America, you got to know the people around Trump, what time did they sort of coalesce to make you someone who's at the forefront of trying to forge a new, perhaps more radical, perhaps certainly original conception of what it is to be right of centre and deal with the problems we face today?
In my mind in 2016, those two issues were distinct. There was Brexit, and then there were the rumblings of the Orange Man. And I didn't actually, in my mind, see the phenomenon as particularly connected. I grew up in Brussels. I've been a Brexiteer pretty much since I was 13 or 14. I've been up close in the belly of the beast, and I knew whereof I spoke. And in 2015, 2016, my abiding memory, I was at Christ Church, Oxford, which is, but pretty, as Oxford College is, probably one of the more right-leaning colleges. I wouldn't say it's exactly conservative, but quite a grand college. As far as I know, I was the only person who was out of the closet on voting for Brexit. But when I spoke to the porters and the groundsmen and the gardeners and the taxi drivers, the scouts, the bedders, I couldn't find a single one who was going to vote Remain. And it was almost this perfect, clean split. And I thought, there's something happening here. And this is not good. This doesn't bode well. And I remember conversations with colleagues. The debates were almost always about the impact of Brexit, not on the nation as a whole, but on higher education alone. And this is what the French have this lovely phrase, déformation professionnelle. It's a sort of, you can only see an issue refracted through the implications for your own tribe or your own profession. And I used to play these sort of parlour games with colleagues. I used to say, well, how many universities have we got in the top 10 in the world? In 2016, it was 4. How many do we have in the top 40? In 2016, it was 7. And then I'd say, how many non-UK EU universities are in the top 10 and the top 40? And the answer to both those questions in 2016 was 0. In other words, we did and do higher education better than the rest, all of the European Union combined. And so the argument that Brexit was going to have this shattering effect on us was itself just it was a very, very weak one.
But it sounds like one of the things you found sort of surprising and worrying among some of your academic colleagues was that they were thinking about this through the prism of what it would do to their, as it were, industry and their sort of sliver of British culture, and not the idea of the nation. And to go on.
Sure. Well, I just add to that. It wasn't so much, you're not thinking about Britain here. It's more that, look, we receive generous subsidies from the British taxpayer to live this wonderfully sinecured life. And part of the kind of implicit social contract there for us is that we serve the nation by modelling civil disagreement, by helping the public and the electorate to navigate morally or technically difficult policy questions. And we're not doing that. What we're doing is we're demonising half the country.
But it's interesting, within what you say there is the idea of a nation. And someone who you've been greatly influenced by, someone who I've read a huge amount of, is the late Sir Roger Scruton, probably the preeminent 20th century conservative thinker of the Western world, I'd say, together with Michael Oakeshott. In his book, Conservatism, A Political Philosophy, the first chapter 2 is Conserving Nature, chapter 1 is Conserving Nations. And he sort of takes it as a given that the idea of the nation, a country, this kind of community of like-minded souls who share a polity, a public space, is a kind of precursor to politics. It's the idea behind politics, a home, if you like, something Kemi Badenoch's very keen on. To what extent is the work that you're trying to do now a reassertion? I think it's been called national conservatism. It's different to nationalism, which is a different thing. to what extent are you trying to reassert the idea of the nation and forge a new nation in a kind of new vision of conservatism?
It's a great question. I think the metaphor of home, which Roger liked to use, and he took the Greek word for home, oikos, and then created this compound, oikophilia, love of home, and its counterpoint, its antonym, oikophobia, that is to say, a kind of irrational repudiation of one's own. And that seems to me, it became clear to me after 2016 that on both sides of the Atlantic, that was the axis on which to understand Western politics. The old politics are sort of left and right ding-dongs about the free market, about state intervention, or about nation building overseas and neoconservatism and so on. All of that was over. And really the primary question was, what is our home? How do we cultivate home? How do we anchor ourselves in home? Now, the question of nation, for now, I think, the nation is probably the most natural structure in which oikophilia is possible. It's not necessarily always going to be a nation. Singapore, is it a nation? Yes, but it's also a kind of city-state. When Aristotle talks about the importance of home, he's talking about a polis, he's talking about a fairly small community that he thinks is about the optimal sort of size for enabling mutual flourishing. And so I think the sort of insight is quite an empirical one. We love what is our own. We love other things too, but we first and foremost have an affection and a loyalty to our family, to our community, to our neighbourhood. And then, as it were, the outermost concentric circle of concrete affection, you might say, is the nation. This, by the way, is why it's not national conservatism is not nationalism. I think the mistake that nationalists make is to put that outermost concentric circle of concrete loyalty, the most important one, above everything else. It's actually, within national conservatism, the weakest form of concrete concentric affection, but it is, as it were, the absolutely indispensable enabling condition of mutual flourishing.
If cultural conditions created certain politics to which you think the answer is national conservatism, how did we get here? What is it about the 20th century and, if you like, the overreach of liberalism I think you'd call it sort of the metastasizing of liberalism that created conditions where, in your view, oikophobia is enabled as opposed to oikophilia?
Well, I suppose what would mark me out as a radical conservative as opposed to a conventional conservative is that, unlike Scruton, I reject the idea that conservatism is somehow as he called it, a hesitation within liberalism, that somehow it's downstream of liberalism, that it's liberalism driving at the speed limit. I think actually conservatism is simply the absence of liberalism and the absence of leftism. Conservatism is what everybody effectively had. That was the sort of organising political and moral and ideological universe before roughly 1789. And I think the error that, one of the interesting debates on the right at the moment is the unravelling of liberalism, and there's an emerging consensus about that on the right and to some extent on the left as well, was this always going to happen? Is it a feature? Is the unravelling a feature of liberalism, or is it a bug? A lot of people would say it's a bug. Douglas Murray, for example, would say it's a bug. Can't we? We can just fix this and go back. I think it's actually a feature. I think it's actually part of the DNA of liberalism that it was always going to unravel. Because
but at some point things are not enough for liberals. It's so funny because Billy Bragg, who's got different politics to you, but in some ways has a kind of would share some of your vision, I think, of the society and a love of home that you'd like to create. Was sat there not so long ago, and he was talking about how there is this kind of progressive spirit within liberalism where the arc of history in his view bends towards inclusion, and you get the sense that talking to him, it's never enough. You've always got to go further and include the next batch.
Right.
You've got to you extend the franchise to women, and then if you make sure that minorities are included, and then you consider trans people. And he would say you just got to keep going. Yeah. It sounds to me like you sort of would say, hang on a second.
Yeah, I mean, I think Billy's way of thinking and the progressive way of thinking, to some extent the Marxist way of thinking, is a secularized version of the Christian doctrine of providence, where the idea is that you do have an arc of history. History is not cyclical, as you might see in Vedantic and Indian traditions. It's heading in a particular direction towards a particular end. Obviously, within theological traditions, that end is not in this world. and you can't just sort of make political paradise here in this world. That's, as it were, it's not going to happen. It's sort of always lying beyond. And that, in a way, is a slightly healthier, it's a bit more conducive to not having radical revolutions and aggressive fixes. But yes, I think you've put your finger on something. For the Liberal, the aim is to attain the sunlit uplands of absolute freedom and emancipation from all unchosen obligations. And the trouble is, when liberalism hits the sunlit uplands, it starts worrying about whether or not it should conserve the sunlit uplands. The Liberal is not a conservative. We don't conserve the sunlit uplands. And what about the moonlit uplands anyway? What about the 0.6% of people who might prefer the moonlit uplands instead? What about them, eh? We've got to emancipate them. And in fact, we shouldn't even be able to call the sunlit uplands the sunlit uplands. Let's just call them the lit uplands. And so on. There's this sort of, there's this emancipatory energy that liberalism has always had. And now that's brought wonderful progress in many ways, but it's also very, very difficult for liberals to stop liberating everybody from everything.
Do you think the problem with liberalism is that it's got the wrong values or that it's got no values?
I think the problem with liberalism is not that it's got no values, but that it gets values in the wrong order. Conservatives and liberals care equally about freedom. They just have a different account of where it should be ranked. And I think, crudely, liberals want to see freedom as upstream of everything, the organising horizon of everything. And conservatives will say, no, that kind of freedom is a license for anarchy. What you need for the real true freedom needs to be, as Burke calls it, ordered freedom. It needs to be downstream of other things, downstream of things that connect us in certain non-negotiable ways to each other. Most classically faith, but also family, flag, nation. That doesn't mean you can't opt out of any of those, but broadly speaking, the most propitious conditions for the only freedom worth having, that is to say, not the freedom just to do whatever we want, but the freedom to do what we ought to do, is going to be downstream of greater goods. And I think that's probably the way to understand it. It's just a question of ranking. But how you rank those different values and those different horizons is going to have enormous downstream effects.
In the founding editorial of the National Review, which is this tremendous American conservative publication, William Buckley wrote that the point of conservatism, his wonderful definition of it, was to stand athwart history yelling stop. And it seems to me that people like you, and this will get us into the sort of MAGA movement and what's happening in British politics, you're dispositionally different, that you seem to want to stand for history yelling go. You want to create something new. You're not a Scrutonian nostalgic for a lost England. He wrote a book you and I have both read called England, an Elegy. You kind of want to forge something new. So can you just explain, and we'll then apply this to American and British politics, how people on the right of politics became more radical in that they demoted freedom and they changed their attitude to stopping history?
Well, great question. And one straightforward answer, just shooting from the hip, is that Reagan and Thatcher's liberalism, conservative liberalism, was conditioned by the twilight of the Cold War. And so that is to say, the kind of animating debate was between Soviet communist tyranny and Western freedom. And so, in some ways, there was just very little difference. There was very little ideological debate either between right and left before 1989. And so, freedom was just seen as something that was just, non-negotiable and something that should be prized because that is what the other lot deny.
So what makes us and them.
Exactly. But I think even there you start to see the tremors, it's not for nothing that Thatcher and Reagan's economic policy is called neoliberalism in all the textbooks, because it was an outlook that was perfectly happy with a kind of dissolution of national boundaries, free trade, free movement of capital in particular. And I think there were some very intelligent left-wing critiques that pointed out that this has a kind of, this sort of conservatism has a sort of solvent power. It has a kind of, it is tearing down our sense of place, our sense of home, the stability of our labour markets and our moral communities and so on. And I think what's been so interesting, and this is partly the Vice President, but there are a lot of other thinkers too, what we're seeing with the new right is the emergence of almost a repudiation of that legacy, of what's seen as a libertarian and overly an unduly liberal economic legacy. And you're seeing, this is why you see a lot more convergence between the new right and the old left than one might think.
So when we're talking about the new right here, and this will get us into the MAGA movement, what is it that the kind of blue Labour and new right traditions share, particularly when it comes to the concern for how the working class has been affected by globalisation?
Yeah. Well, I would say the short answer to that is a primacy on home, a sense of belonging and community. And one of the most sort of powerful features, I think, of the British left is the kind of the Keir Hardie late 19th century pre-Fabian Christian socialism, which is roughly a kind of communitarianism, focuses a lot on place, and on the conditions of labour, and so on and so forth. And of course, you've got the Ruskins and the William Morrises and so on. And I think that is something that is entirely in tune with the new right, with this sort of conservative suspicion that free marketeers, that libertarian attitudes to culture and economics are in fact not really conservative at all. And that's not to say they're not important. It's not to say that conservatives are statists. And we can come to talk about the state maybe in a little bit. For the moment, I think my sense is, in sort of intellectual circles, there's this term post-liberalism, and nobody really knows what it is. It seems to be a kind of placeholder for our ignorance, and basically it collects together people who think that something's gone wrong in liberalism.
So I almost feel bad to ask you this, because if you Google Dr. James Orr, everyone goes, "Oh, he's the Vance whisperer," and all this, that, and the other.
Don't believe any of it.
But don't believe it. But the fact is, you're friends with the Vice President of America. Tell me what, if you wouldn't mind, what he says to you about what he wants to do to politics, because I think one of the most important ways of understanding J.D. Vance, I mean, the founding textbook of all this stuff is an extraordinary book, strongly recommend to all of our listeners, called Hillbilly Elegy, which is about where J.D. Vance grew up and what happened when globalisation turned up. But what is J.D. Vance, who might well represent a sort of, Trumpism, what is he trying to do in America?
Mm-hmm. Well, what he's trying to do right now is to be as loyal a vice president to Trump as he possibly can be. And I think he's doing that remarkably well. And I think in exchange, Trump is giving him a remarkably, as it were, wide scope. I think he's the most interesting and consequential vice president in living memory. Not just not just the Munich speech of a few months ago, but the Paris speech he delivered that same week. That speech alone would have marked him out as one of the most interesting vice presidents.
Why was the Paris speech so?
So the Paris speech sort of laid out the a sort of an American vision, an extremely optimistic sort of America First vision of AI and technology.
Of course. So is that the AI summit?
The AI summit. This was a glimpse at what right-wing progressivism might be, what right-wing futurism might be, what it might be to be a conservative that is open to the future, is open to the power of technology.
Stand for history yelling go.
Exactly right.
History yelling stop.
To go back to the Buckley, to your reversing of the Buckley line. And so there's lots of things that could be said, but I would say he is, the reason he was chosen, even though Trump was out polling him in Ohio, there was no obvious electoral benefit to selecting him as the as the running mate. It might have been much more straightforward to go for a Rubio or a Tim Johnson to sort of lock up some of the votes that they might be able to lock up. But Trump very consciously didn't do a Biden. He said, "I'm not playing identity politics here. We're going for somebody who I think he was persuaded that he needed a Dauphin. He needed a successor. He needed somebody who could somehow embody and understand Trumpism, so that there would be Trumpism beyond Trump." And I think so that I think is the sort of the best way of understanding the vice president's sort of ideological horizon, is to push Trumpism forward. And Trumpism, I think, I suppose I would say this because I'm very much involved in the movement, but I do think national conservatism is probably the best label you could give to that sort of ideological framework that is America First. It's the sort of the politics of of national preference, to coin the title of an interesting new book by a guy called Philip Cunliffe. That effectively our politics should be first and foremost organised by what is conducive to the flourishing of the demos.
Hasn't liberalism achieved gains for once excluded groups, but also in the economic sphere for all Americans, that people like J.D. Vance and Donald Trump profited from. Donald Trump's one of the most interesting men alive, obviously. He's really, in a way, a creature of the 1970s and 1980s New York, a period of Thatcher and Reagan, a sort of period that...
He's a limousine liberal, I think, is what they call it.
He's a limousine liberal. So is it... Oh, well, there you go. So isn't Donald Trump someone who was created by a kind of spirit of economic laissez-faire, Chicago school freedom, which came with the downsides for those written about in Hillbilly Elegy? And therefore, isn't there something almost inconsistent or hypocritical about Trump? It might be that he would say, well, it's overreach, we want to go too far. But look, this is a property developer from Queens, New York, a limousine liberal, in your words. Isn't he created by the very circumstances he's now trying to undo?
It's a great question. I think the diagnosis that the Vice President and others have to make is not so much that, there were excesses in the 80s and 90s, although I think he probably wouldn't have been on board with economic neoliberalism had he sort of been around at the time. I think the criticism really starts with the early 2000s and the rapid effects, the sort of the rapid development of globalization after China's admission to the World Trade Organization and a whole load of other things as well. And the perception there was that national interests should be subordinated to everything else, that borders should be effectively dissolved because they were economic constraints on flourishing. And I think what came so sort of quickly with that is this extraordinary wave of deindustrialization all across the Midwest, Central America, and the emergence, of course, of the flyover states. And you see this across continental Europe, you see it in Britain as well. And that's the sense of, look, economic freedom is important, free trade is important, a sort of relatively minimal state is important, but this is not what we're getting. What we're seeing is a sense of economic dispossession and marginalization, which is directly the result of this sort of, we could just about handle it in the 80s and 90s. There was enough to go round, but now there is a sense of deep, deep dispossession and dislocation between the haves and the have-nots.
Now, I'm very, very keen not to typecast you as a spokesperson for the American government. They can speak for themselves, and we'll ask them the questions when we get the chance. But do you have any concern that in some of, for instance, Donald Trump's attacks on judges and the courts and the conventions of democracy, there is, again, this inconsistency. There's this undermining of one of the things that has made America great, which is this country that had a revolution pretty recently, 5 minutes ago in the course of human history, built fantastically strong institutions based on the rule of law, which the president, who's acting in a somewhat kingly way, is undermining. Does that concern you at all?
It's a central question on the right, both in America and in Britain, for conservatives. How do we conserve institutions that seem to be hostile to us, or seem to be hostile to what we take to be the founding ideals and purposes of these institutions? And I think that's the best way, that's the best prism to understand the sort of Trump critique of the federal judiciary or of other kind of classic institutions that Reagan wouldn't have dreamed of criticizing. There is a sense that there's been a kind of wave of what you might call ideological capture of institutions all across the West. And that puts conservatives in a very difficult position because we don't like the thought that we're attacking what we're designed to conserve, what our spirit is to conserve. And so I think this is going to be a key question on the right, not just in America but in Britain too. Do we simply burn down these institutions? Do we scrap the BBC license fee? Do we just privatize it all? Or do we try and conserve it?
Do you think years from now, 50 years from now, when you and I are kind of maybe doing another podcast, wherever it might be then, and looking back on this moment, do you think we'll sort of define it as the era where there was a really widespread revolt against globalization?
Yeah.
That really, when you talk about the politics of national preference, when you read Hillbilly Elegy, when you talk to J.D. Vance, when you look at what Nigel Farage and the Centre for a Better Britain are doing, what you're ultimately driven by is a feeling that two ideas dominated the late 20th century. One was the idea of liberalism and the idea that globalization was happening. And what we're seeing now and what you embody is a feeling that liberalism is not enough on the one hand, and secondly, that globalization did not work out.
I would agree with that. There's that wonderful anecdote that was unfortunately almost certainly apocryphal of Deng Xiaoping being asked what he thought of the French Revolution. And he replies, too soon to tell. And whether or not he said that, it's a great insight into just the longitudinal nature of Chinese thinking. I don't think it's too soon to tell now. I think, when we are aging pensioners, worrying about the triple lock having been dissolved and shattered, doing another podcast.
Annoyed about the lack of triple lock.
I think, one way to say it is say we're looking back on the sort of the long 20th century, 1914 to 2016. But I think actually it'll be more civilizational than that. I think we'll look back on it as the age of liberalism, and that what we're living through is the twilight of liberalism and the emergence of something new, maybe something strange, maybe something terrible. But I think actually we can be hopeful about what comes next. So I think what we're looking at is we'll look back on it as a kind of 1789 to 2016, and that what we were worrying about in the 2020s was really the fallout of the end of that great age, that great chapter of liberalism, with all the benefits that it brought, but all the kind of problems and chaos and conflict that it engendered as well.
Dr. James Orr, it's always a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much for coming in.
Great to be with you.
Thank you so much for watching this episode of Radical with Amol, Rajan, and indeed with Dr. James Orr. I hope you feel it's given you a deeper understanding of where British and maybe American politics is going. Now, there's going to be a new conversation of this kind, sometimes with people you agree with, sometimes with people you really disagree with, but we're going to do that for you every single week on Radical. And if you want to listen to this as a podcast and listen on the move, all you've got to do is subscribe. Just head to BBC Sounds, search for Radical with Amol Rajan, hit subscribe, and make sure your push notifications are turned on. We'll be back at the same time next week. Thank you so much for watching, and goodbye.